Welcome. You've joined us for this deep dive into a really critical issue, the redistribution of power and wealth in our modern capitalist economies. You provided some fascinating material really highlighting the significant concentration of wealth and power we're seeing.
It's quite stark when you look at the numbers.
It really is. So our goal today, our mission, is to kind of extract the key insights from these progressive frameworks that aim to address these imbalances.
Right.
We'll be focusing on how they propose to, redistribute economic wealth and also shift decision-making power.
Two huge areas.
Exactly. Okay, so let's unpack this central question then. Given these, frankly, concerning levels of wealth and power concentration you highlighted, how can progressive frameworks realistically and effectively address these imbalances, in a way that fosters a more just and prosperous society?
That's the core question, isn't it? And what's particularly telling from the sources, I think, is this idea that the extreme concentration isn't just some economic quirk. It seems to have really deep roots in our political systems or societal structures.
Yeah.
The data you shared, it just clearly illustrates the extent of it, really.
Yeah.
It sets the stage for a necessary discussion about, well, potential remedies. What can we do?
Absolutely. So let's get right into that first major proposed solution then. Progressive taxation, aimed at achieving greater wealth equity. At its heart, as your sources detail, this is basically a tax system where, higher levels of wealth are subject to higher tax rates. Simple concept.
On the surface, yeah. The objective is to sort of rebalance that tax burden, increase the obligations on the very wealthiest, while maybe easing them for the middle and working classes.
And this conversation goes beyond just income tax, doesn't it? We're also looking at the potential for actual wealth taxes or surtaxes designed to sort of moderate the accumulation of these vast personal fortunes.
Indeed. And the concept of establishing some kind of threshold for personal wealth, I think your sources mention an idea maybe 300 times the median wealth, something like that.
Yeah, that was one example.
It really makes you stop and think about where that balance lies, between individual success and, well, broader societal well-being.
It does. And when you consider the widening gulf in compensation, it just underscores the urgency here.
Oh, absolutely. In the U.S., that ratio, CEO to worker pay, it was around 20 to 1 back in 1965.
20 to 1? Okay.
By 2022, it had just exploded 344 to 1.
Wow. 344.
Yeah. And what's really telling about that massive increase isn't just the raw numbers, it's the decoupling it represents.
Decoupling. How so?
Well, it suggests a real shift away from a model where maybe worker productivity gains were more broadly shared towards one where, a really disproportionate share of the value created just accrues right to the very top.
That makes sense.
And you might find it interesting to consider how this shift coincided with, say, changes in corporate governance or maybe the decline of unionization, things like that.
That's a stark illustration of that growing divide, absolutely. And it's not just income, as you said. The sheer scale of wealth held by these ultra-high net worth individuals, UHNWIs, it's quite remarkable.
It really is. Back in 2017, you had roughly, 226,000 people globally?
Something like that, yeah.
Holding an estimated $27 trillion.
$27 trillion.
And fast forward to 2024, the world's billionaires, just the billionaires, saw their wealth increase by over $2 trillion in just 1 year.
Just unbelievable growth at the top. Now, this next set of data you provided, this really brings the scale of the issue into sharp focus for me. What's been happening with the middle class during all this?
Precisely. While you see this dramatic wealth expansion at the very, very top, the sources highlight a really concerning trend for the middle class, both in the U.S. and in Canada.
Okay.
So in the U.S., the proportion of adults in middle-class households actually decreased. It went from about 61% in 1971 down to 50% by 2021.
So shrinking.
Shrinking. And their share of the total aggregate income also saw a significant decline from 62% down to 42% over that same period.
Wow. And the wealth distribution trends are similar, right? Not just income.
Exactly. Still in the U.S., the middle 60%, their share of total wealth shrank from 37% in 1990 down to just 26% by 2022.
So it paints this picture of a middle class that's not only getting smaller in number, but also holding a much smaller piece of the overall economic pie.
That's right. And the Canadian data, it really echoes this, maybe slightly different magnitudes, but the direction is clear.
Okay, what does it show for Canada?
Well, between 1982 and 2000, the real income for the bottom 50% essentially stagnated, didn't really go anywhere.
Flatlined.
Pretty much. And looking at wealth growth, say between 1999 and 2012, it was heavily, heavily concentrated at the top. The wealthiest 20% held nearly 47% of all household wealth by 2012.
Nearly half.
And more recently, just in the first quarter of 2024, income inequality in Canada actually reached its highest level since 2008.
Since the financial crisis.
Yeah, okay.
And the wealth disparity itself.
Quite pronounced. By the second quarter of 2024, the wealthiest 20% in Canada held a staggering 67.7% of the total net worth.
Over 2/3.
Yeah, averaging about $3.4 million per household in that group.
And the bottom.
The bottom 40%. They held just 2.8%, an average of just under $70,000.
That gap is huge.
It is, and your source even points out that this wealth gap between the top 20% and the bottom 40% actually increased over the past year.
Widened further.
Mm-hmm. And we can't forget the top 1% in Canada. They control nearly about 24.8% of the nation's total net wealth.
It's quite sobering, isn't it, to think about what that kind of disparity means for, individual opportunities, social cohesion.
Absolutely. And these figures from both countries, they clearly illustrate why progressive taxation is such a central proposal in addressing this imbalance.
Right.
As your sources emphasize, the aim isn't really to penalize success. It's more about recognizing that, substantial wealth accumulation comes with a greater capacity, and therefore maybe a greater responsibility to contribute to the systems that made that wealth possible in the first place, and to ensure a more equitable society overall.
And crucially, the evidence seems to suggest that societies can implement higher taxes on top incomes without necessarily hurting overall economic vitality, right?
That's a really crucial point. Your sources even connect the high marginal tax rates we saw in the post-World War II decades with periods of really strong economic growth and significant innovation. It suggests that reinvesting in public goods, it can actually act as a powerful catalyst for broader prosperity.
So it's not automatically a drag on the economy.
The evidence suggests not necessarily, no. There's also this underlying idea of maybe shifting societal values a bit towards a greater emphasis on collective well-being alongside individual achievement.
A different kind of balance.
Precisely. The progressive taxation models being discussed, they aren't really about eliminating affluence or preventing comfortable lives for the wealthy. As your sources indicate, even with higher tax rates, affluent individuals would likely still enjoy considerable financial security. The core objective is really just to moderate the extremes of wealth concentration.
To prevent the kind of undue influence and potential societal instability that can come from those vast inequalities.
Exactly.
Now, a big question, obviously, when you talk about this scale of wealth redistribution is, how do you get buy-in? Particularly from the ultra-wealthy. How do you mitigate things like resistance or capital flight?
That's a huge practical challenge.
Yeah. And this is where that idea of the Societal Contribution Compact, or UHNWIs, comes into play in the sources. Can you elaborate a bit on how this framework aims to sort of integrate them into this transition?
Yeah, this compact idea offers a really interesting alternative, I think. Instead of solely relying on taxation as, just an obligation.
Right, something imposed.
Exactly. It proposes a more collaborative approach. It tries to balance the contribution of a portion of their surplus wealth with tangible benefits and recognize societal roles for the UHNWIs.
So turning a potentially adversarial dynamic into more of a partnership.
That seems to be the aim, yes.
Okay, so what are the key components then? How does it try to achieve this collaboration? It sounds like it's more than just a different tax structure.
Oh, it is. The first element mentioned is something called guaranteed lifestyle security.
Okay.
So participating UHNWIs would receive government-backed guarantees for, say, a substantial personal asset base and a consistent, generous income stream, especially during economic downturns.
Ah, so it's like an insurance policy for them almost.
Yeah.
Addressing that basic need for security, even at that level of wealth.
Exactly. It directly addresses that fundamental human need, which could potentially alleviate some of the anxiety that might fuel resistance to significant wealth redistribution.
That makes sense. What's the second component?
The second is pretty novel: exclusive influence via stewardship civic coins.
Stewardship civic coins. Okay, what are those?
Imagine it like this. For every significant chunk of surplus wealth someone contributes, beyond a certain agreed-upon equitable threshold, they receive a number of these special coins.
Okay.
Now, these aren't financial instruments you can trade. They're purely for, participatory voting power.
Voting on what?
On designated societal investment funds. The collective weight of all these coins from all the participants would then guide how that pool of reinvested surplus wealth gets allocated.
Huh. So instead of just paying taxes into a general government pot,
Right.
they'd have a direct collective say in how a significant portion of those resources is actually reinvested back into society.
Exactly. They could collectively decide to direct funds towards, say, critical infrastructure projects or maybe cutting-edge scientific research, arts and culture, strategic investments, things that align with democratically established priorities.
So it shifts them from being just taxpayers to being active
Yeah.
stewards, I guess,
Oh,
stewards of societal progress.
that's the idea. Active stewards.
That's a really innovative way to potentially incentivize participation and maybe leverage their expertise in directing resources too.
What about the more personal motivations? Recognition, legacy.
That's where the third component comes in, public recognition and legacy building.
Okay.
The system would formally acknowledge significant contributions made through this reinvestment. For instance, major projects could be named after contributors. There should even be national honors for exceptional societal impact.
So tapping into that desire for recognition, for leaving a positive mark, shifting the focus of prestige maybe from just having wealth to contributing wealth effectively.
Precisely. Moving prestige from mere accumulation to demonstrable contributions to the common good.
I can see the potential appeal there. And what's the final element you mentioned?
The final piece is negotiation options for aligned wealth utilization.
Meaning?
This just recognizes that many UHNWIs have specific areas they're really passionate about or maybe possess unique expertise in.
So they'd have the opportunity to negotiate with, relevant government bodies to direct a portion of their contributed wealth, or maybe the collectively managed funds, towards projects that align with both their personal interests and broader societal goals.
Okay, so for example, someone really interested in, say, fusion energy research could potentially negotiate to steer funds specifically towards that goal within the larger framework.
Exactly. It allows for that personal vision to still drive innovation, but hopefully within that larger framework of collective benefit.
Interesting. Now, how would individuals actually enter this system? Is it opt-in, mandatory?
The mechanism described is designed to be both incentivizing and forward-looking. For existing UHNWIs, participation in the Societal Contribution Compact would be voluntary.
Good, voluntary.
Driven by the benefits offered, the security, the influence, the recognition.
Right.
However, for individuals who newly reach that ultra-high net worth threshold after the system is fully operational, participation would become an automatic aspect of their wealth management framework. So it's a blend. Encouraging voluntary buy-in initially, while establishing it as the standard for future wealth accumulation at that extreme level.
Seems to be the idea, yes. A more adaptable, maybe more palatable approach than just straight mandates from day one.
Okay, so we've talked about mechanisms for collecting wealth, potentially channeling it through this compact idea. Now let's dig into the direct mechanisms of wealth redistribution. Where would these resources actually go to improve equity and opportunity on the ground?
Yeah, good question. Your sources strongly emphasize that the revenue generated, whether from progressive taxes or the compact, needs to be strategically deployed, needs to tangibly improve equality of opportunity and societal outcomes.
Right.
And a key example of a direct redistribution mechanism that comes up repeatedly is universal basic income, UBI.
UBI. Providing a regular, unconditional income to every citizen, establishing that fundamental baseline of economic security.
Exactly. It acts as that foundational safety net, doesn't it? Ensuring everyone has a minimum level of financial support, regardless of their employment status or whatever else. And your sources mentioned some interesting outcomes from UBI pilot programs, didn't they?
They did. The Finnish pilot, for instance, while it was focused on the unemployed, indicated that participants reported, greater levels of happiness, lower stress, even a stronger sense of purpose.
Interesting.
Similarly, the Ontario Basic Income pilot in Canada, before it was canceled, suggested positive impacts on financial stability and mental health among participants.
So these initial findings, though maybe limited, suggest that providing that basic level of economic dignity can have real positive ripple effects for individuals, for communities.
That seems to be the implication, yes.
Okay, so beyond UBI, what other crucial areas would this redistributed wealth be directed towards, according to the frameworks?
Well, the sources consistently point to the vital role of funding essential public services. Things like universal healthcare systems.
Critical.
tuition-free access to education at all levels,
Mm-hmm.
robust, affordable housing programs, expanded social support networks, the pillars of a strong social safety net.
These are all crucial investments, right? They directly contribute to things like the Human Development Index, that greater measure of well-being, not just GDP.
Exactly. It's not just about money. It's about health, education, lifespan.
And these improvements, in turn, they can fuel long-term economic growth, foster greater innovation, creating a kind of positive feedback loop.
That's the argument. And the example of a country like Germany often comes up. A nation with a high HDI, a relatively equitable social model, but which also stands as a leader in innovation.
Right, it underscores that connection. Investing in people isn't just a social good. It can actually be a smart economic strategy, too.
Precisely. Now, we've mostly talked about individual wealth so far, but corporations obviously hold significant economic power. How does this framework address ensuring equitable corporate contribution?
That's a really important piece of the puzzle.
Absolutely. Your sources argue this is kind of a non-negotiable aspect of any comprehensive wealth redistribution effort. It requires really reevaluating, maybe rebalancing the relationship between the corporate sector and the broader society.
So it's about ensuring corporations contribute their fair share and act as responsible partners, not just profit maximizers.
That's the gist of it, yes. Responsible partners in societal development, not solely entities focused on maximizing shareholder value above all else.
Okay, so what are some of the specific proposals for achieving that more equitable corporate contribution?
Well, key measures include things like closing existing tax loopholes that allow corporations, especially multinationals, to avoid paying their fair share.
Right, loopholes.
And implementing minimum global corporate tax rates. That's a big one, trying to prevent that race to the bottom in tax policies between countries.
Makes sense.
Additionally, there are proposals to actually link corporate tax rates or maybe incentives to specific metrics, like that CEO to worker pay ratio we talked about.
Tying taxes to pay ratios.
Or maybe a company's environmental impact? Your sources even mention the possibility of, surtaxes on firms that exhibit really extreme levels of pay disparity.
So, creating a system of incentives and disincentives to encourage more equitable and responsible corporate behavior.
That's the idea. And thinking about how progressive corporate taxation could directly contribute.
Yeah.
The revenues generated could be strategically allocated, maybe to fund crucial initiatives like worker retraining programs, especially in communities negatively impacted by corporate practices like, say, automation.
Okay, so for instance, if a tech firm's automation leads to job losses, a portion of the tax revenue from their increased productivity could be directed towards reskilling those affected workers, or maybe providing job guarantees.
Exactly. It's about trying to ensure that technological progress benefits society more broadly, and that companies contribute to the well-being of the communities they operate in and profit from.
The whole system seems built on this principle of shared prosperity, then, that companies benefiting from society have a responsibility to invest back into its well-being.
That's a good way to put it. Shared prosperity. Now, there's one final element in your sources that I found particularly thought-provoking.
Oh, yeah. What's that?
The integration of price management for societal well-being. This goes beyond just taxes and social programs.
Price management, like price controls. Isn't that usually frowned upon by economists?
Well, yes, your sources acknowledge the conventional economic arguments against broad price controls, potential shortages, disincentives, black markets, that sort of thing.
Right.
But they propose a more targeted and nuanced approach, especially for truly essential goods and services.
Okay, targeted, like what?
They point to existing examples, actually. Price management in various countries, India for essential medicines, rent regulations in cities like New York, even temporary freezes on prices of emergency supplies during crises.
Okay.
Canada's approach to controlling prescription drug prices is another relevant example that comes up.
So how does this proposed system aim to mitigate those risks, the shortages and disincentives that economists worry about?
The key seems to lie in its integration with a direct democracy framework and the use of AI-driven oversight.
AI oversight. Interesting.
Yeah. So rather than implementing rigid, top-down price ceilings across the board, the idea is to establish democratically determined and AI-informed price boundaries.
Price boundaries.
For a carefully selected set of essential goods and services. Things identified through that consensus priority list process we've discussed before.
Right, the CPL.
Right.
So what kind of essentials are we talking about here?
Things like basic energy needs, staple food items, fundamental internet connectivity, public transportation, access to clean water and sanitation, maybe baseline childcare and elder care, the real necessities.
Okay, the basics for a decent life. So how would these price boundaries actually be implemented and managed in practice?
It sounds like a multi-stage process. First, a sophisticated AI system, they call it AGIA, would continuously analyze things like production costs, supply chain dynamics, demand trends.
Yeah, okay, get the data.
Right. To provide a really comprehensive understanding of the potential impact of any proposed price boundary.
Got it. Then what?
Then citizens, informed by this AI analysis and probably expert testimony, would engage in deliberation. They'd ultimately set the acceptable price ranges or maybe limits on annual price adjustments for these essentials.
So it's not arbitrary price caps set by bureaucrats. It's data-informed, but with direct democratic input setting the boundaries.
Exactly. And the focus would be on ensuring, say, modest, fair profit margins in these critical sectors, enough to keep investment flowing, but preventing price gouging.
And flexible.
Yes, the boundaries could be dynamically adjusted over time based on changing costs and market conditions, trying to maintain stable supply and ongoing investment.
And crucially, it's targeted. Just at these fundamental necessities, not the whole economy.
That seems key. Targeting essentials where maybe monopolistic conditions or inelastic demand pose risks. And importantly, these price boundaries wouldn't operate in isolation.
How so?
They'd work in conjunction with things like UBI, progressive taxation, those principles of shared corporate responsibility, creating a more holistic, mutually supportive system.
It sounds like a much more sophisticated, maybe more adaptive approach than just blunt price controls, potentially leading to greater public legitimacy. Reduced chances for exploitation?
That seems to be the argument. More legitimacy, less exploitability, and the ability to make evidence-based adjustments, maybe even in near real time.
So leveraging transparency, corporate responsibility, public oversight, creating a calibrated instrument to enhance social welfare by ensuring access to essentials while still allowing for reasonable returns.
That captures it well, I think.
Okay, so to kind of synthesize all this then, this deep dive into these progressive frameworks for wealth and power redistribution, it really brings to the forefront a fundamental ethical point, doesn't it?
Which is
That maybe an economy should function primarily to serve the well-being of all its people.
a fundamental reorientation, perhaps.
Yeah. And things like progressive taxation, establishing that societal contribution compact, implementing UBI, strategic investments in public services, demanding equitable corporate contributions, even this carefully considered price management.
They're all presented as interconnected tools, right? Aimed at mitigating those extreme inequalities that can, erode social cohesion and potentially undermine democratic principles.
And ultimately, the stated aim is to build a foundation for a more inclusive, more equitable society, one where economic power doesn't automatically translate into disproportionate political influence, and where prosperity is much more broadly shared.
Well, this has certainly been a comprehensive exploration of these ideas.
It has indeed. A lot to think about. And for you, our listener, as you reflect on all of this, maybe consider this final thought. What single aspect of wealth concentration do you believe has the most profound, the most far-reaching consequences for our society today? And maybe what are the underlying reasons for your perspective? It's definitely something to mull over. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.